Welcome to everybody. You mostly, I imagine, all know Dr. Allawi. My name is Patrick Coburn. I genuinely don't think there's much need for me to do any prolonged introduction, except to say that Dr. Allawi is a great historian, thinker, politician at one time, has covered all aspects of life in Iraq and other parts of the region. I've never spoken to him without improvement, and I think the same will be true this evening. So let me immediately hand over to you, Robert. Doing any more.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick and I go back a long way, so whatever he has said should be discounted a bit, but thank you anyway. You're most kind. My talk today is not really about the Sunni-Shi'a conflict from a doctrinal or from the point of view of polemics. This is something that I would avoid, and this is really not the right forum to discuss whether the Shias are right or the Sunnis are right, and what are the history of polemics between these two great orthodoxies, I call them, the two orthodoxies of Islam, rather than the two sects of Islam, has been going on for nearly 1400 years, and without any resolution in sight. My main concern here is how do these two communities relate to each other, and how have they related to each other in the past, and how have they related to power? How does power, especially political power, affect the relationships between the two communities and between these communities and those in power and authority over them? So it is more to do with the ebb and flow of intersectarian relationships in Islam over time in history, and of course with some emphasis on contemporary times, contemporary events. So probably half the talk will be a kind of pocket history, as it were, of Shia-Sunni coexistence, rivalries, tensions, and confrontations. And the other half would be on what are the implications of this alarming increase in sectarian feelings that we can see, especially after 2003 in Iraq, but more particularly after the beginning or the launching of the war in Syria. Very, very early on, again, I don't want to give you a potted history of Shi'ism, but Shi'ism is more of a mood, I think, and rather than an exposition of a clear creed and structure. So it is a sentiment. The early Shias were a sentiment, were a kind of tendency, a kind of expression of loyalties and commitments, more than just doctrinal differences. And these, so if you look at when Islam spread outside of the Arabian Peninsula in the early years, those groups that had yet to form, as it were, a definitive creedal and doctrinal structures, as it were the proto-Shias, could be found in not everywhere in the Islamic world, but only in certain areas. For example, in garrison towns like in Kufa and Qom, in regions, outlying areas like Khorasan, and with tribes that were known particularly for their loyalty to the cause of Imam Ali. So in the early years, I would say in the first century and a half, my reading of it is that Shi'ism had not yet taken on a sectarian form, in the sense that it had in it a definitive creedal structures and creedal doctrines. At the same time, the Sunnis generally had not yet gelled into what later became known as Jama'at Sunnism. So up to the end of the Umayyads, you'd have in Kufa, there were Shia groups, moderate Shias in the sense that those who generally supported the cause of Imam Ali, but not necessarily giving it a distinctive form. There were Khawarij in Kufa, there were the Murji'a, there were supporters of the Umayyads, Marwanis, also followers of the Medinan schools of Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas. Basra, there were very, very few Shias at the end of the Umayyad period. They were mainly supporters of Uthman in Basra. Also some Mu'tazila and some Khawarij. And Medina and Mecca were primarily the followers of the beginnings of Sunni doctrinal thought, mainly the schools of Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas. And in Syria, there were very, very few supporters of the cause of Imam Ali, whether moderate or radical. They were mainly supporters of the Umayyads, Marwanis. Khorasan, though, had a very large component of people who were proto-Shias, those who would later go on to form the various groups. With the Abbasi revolution, with the Abbasi overthrow of the Umayyads, these two tendencies began to gel in doctrinal terms. And I would say that the way in which the Abbasis confirmed their power as legitimate caliphs or khulafa is by creating a kind of doctrinal middle ground, which accepted some of the claims of the supporters of the cause of the Alawis, the Allied cause, and nevertheless tried to address the concerns of the majority piety-minded by confirming these doctrinal schools. They offered basically the restive populations a kind of half deal. You support the Abbasi cause, we will formalize the main schools, main doctrinal terms and creedal terms, and we would accept some of the claims of the Shia. So a kind of moderate Jama'at Sunnism emerged in the early days of the Abbasis, leaving those who did not accept this as the beginnings of the germs, as it were, that led, germination that led later to the full flowering of Ithna Ashari Shi'ism. So, in some ways, the Shi'as, the early Shi'as of the early Abbasi period, you could call them, as it were, the refuseniks of Islam, in the sense that they did not accept the compromise that was offered. And they were a minority, certainly, and continue to be a minority throughout the early years of the Abbasid Empire. But as they began to gel doctrinally, so they began to gel as communities. And when Abu Ja'far al-Mansur founded Baghdad, he did not divide it into areas where particular sects lived. But it transpired that with time, as the Shias began to gel around the notions of the foundational notions of the Imamiyya, you had areas of Baghdad that became associated with them. The Karkh, for example, or the area of what is known as Bab al-Taq. And what happened in Baghdad happened also in most of the other major towns and cities of the Islamic Empire. So wherever you went, especially in the heartland and going east, you had the towns divided into various areas, sometimes between within the own jama'ats. There was Hanafi areas, Hanbali areas, Shafi'i areas. But the Shia areas were specific. And they did not form a majority, a case of my readings, in any of the major cities of the Islamic ecumen, as it were, of the Abbasi period. Now, as they began to turn into a community, and as their doctrines began to become formalized, and as their internal structures and organization became more and more established, you see then the beginnings of increasing tensions between communities. Before, as I said, you did not have tensions between communities because the communities themselves were not yet fully formed. So if you're looking for Sunni Shia rivalries and conflicts and confrontations before the Abbasi period, you would not be able to identify them in this way and shape. It's only when they became embedded within urban structures that the divisions began to crystallize. Nearly all the Shias of the 2nd and 3rd century of the Hijrah in Baghdad were Imamis. There were very few Ismaili communities in Iraq at that point, although most of the Shias, I would have thought, by the 2nd century, were in fact leaning towards Ismailism, but not in Baghdad and not generally in Iraq as a whole. The Buwayhiya, or the Buyids, as they're called in English, although they were supposed to be in favor of the Shias, generally were much more concerned about staying in power, and in many cases, they in fact took anti-Shia positions, anti-Imami positions, even though they were technically Zaydi Shias. So if you look at the period of the 2nd century in Baghdad, there were quite a few serious disturbances and riots, and they're related in all the major chronicles of the historians, especially Ibn al-Athir, who talks about the continuing disturbances between the Karkh, Bab al-Taq, and the other areas of Baghdad. Generally, they were to do with certain aspects of Shia doctrine or Shia practices that were found to be objectionable by the majority Sunni population. From Baghdad at that point in the 2nd century were many Hanbalis. And the reason I'm talking about that is because a lot of these themes reappear in history and are now very, very much in evidence. So these things did not go away. They're not something that happened 1,000 years ago and have been forgotten. The main focus of the Hanbali, particularly the Hanbali rejection of Shi'ism, was to do with the assertion of the Shia regarding the superiority of Imam Ali over all the other Sahabas of the Prophet. Of course, by this very act, you undermine the entire framework of the Ahl al-Hadith, who base their doctrines on the primacy of the Hadith and the narrators of the Hadith, hence the companions. So by making this claim, the Hanbalis found this extremely offensive. And in many cases, this was used as a pretext for large-scale riots and disturbances against the Shia. The other main issue that seems to have exercised the Hanbalis of the period was to do with the form of the adhan, especially the Shia edition of Hayy ala Khair al-Amal, which was seen to be a kind of innovation that again undermined their conception of a fundamental ritual of Islam. And lastly is to do with the whole issue of Muharram and the commemorations of Muharram and the association in Hanbali eyes of Muharram with the whole issue of veneration of tombs and visitations of tombs and so on. So you had several very, very serious riots. One of them, according to the chroniclers, led to something like the entire area of Karkh was burnt down, and up to 17,000 people were killed. We're talking here about the 2nd century of Islam, of the Hijri era, somewhere in the 9th century, late 9th and early 10th century. And that was the beginning of the use of the term the Rafida, when the Shias were identified specifically as those who rejected the Khilafah, especially of Abu Bakr and Uthman. But violence in that period was really a function of the astuteness and the willingness of the political authority to exercise its power And whenever the political authority chose to do so, and was strong enough to do so, there were long and sometimes very long periods of quite amicable forms of coexistence. When political power was used in favor of generally of the majority Sunni community, even during the Buwayhi period, it led to the encouragement of dissension and great some disturbances. You would say that between the readings, my readings, is between every 25 to 40 years in the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Abbasi era, we had very serious flare-ups of intercommunity strife. Nearly all where the Sunni majority attacked the Shia neighborhoods and destroyed their homes and shops. And I could not trace one example. There were cases of individual killings and assassinations and so on. But there was only one case where there was a kind of counter riot, where the Shias emerged out of their neighborhoods in Karkh and Bab al-Taq to attack Sunni areas. The anti-Shia episodes in the Abbasi period reached their peak with Al-Qadir, who was technically a protege of a Shia dynasty, the Buwayhiya. But he was an extreme Hanbali and used a lot of the Hanbali justifications for continuing the attacks and discriminations that were quite widespread in this period against the Shia. Now, skipping forward another 100 years or 200 years, you end up with the Khalifa al-Nasir, Nasir Lidin al-Abbasi, who is entirely an opposite figure, where his ideal was a kind of unification, at least at the level of action, at least at the level of institutions between the two communities. And during his quite long period of rule, nearly 40 years, there was not a single episode, serious episode, of Sunni Shi'i rioting or disturbances, because he was a conscious policy on his part to try to bring the two communities together, if not doctrinally, at least operationally and institutionally, working under the rubric of the chivalrous societies, the Futuha, and also by a kind of inclusive Sufism of Sheikh Umar Sahrawardi, who took within the expressions of Tasawwuf large elements of Shia veneration of the Ahlul Bayt. And in his period, during Salman al-Farisi's station was elevated, all the craft guilds, al-Asnaf of Baghdad, had to choose, as it were, their spiritual guide, and it was either Imam Ali alayhi salam or Salman al-Farisi. So the example of al-Nasir is, even in a period where you could have construed an overall anti-Shia sentiment or anti-Shia past, as it were, you could still reverse that trend. And you could reverse it with great advantage, both to the ruler as well as to the body politic itself. Al-Nasir did not really revive the Abbasi Khilafah, but he certainly strengthened his hold over Iraq. And one of the most significant factors behind that was the generally amicable relationships between the communities under his rule. Move forward another 50 years, and you end up with probably the worst Khalifa in Abbasi history, Musta'sim Billah, under whose watch his indifference and his lassitude and his open partiality to the Sunnis, very, very large riots took place in Baghdad, encouraged sometimes by him, encouraged also by his Turkish troops, Turkish officers. And you had the famous riots of Al-Karkh of 1252, 6 years before the Mongol invasion, where there were literally hundreds, possibly thousands killed, and created a great sense of bitterness and alienation on the part of the population of Karkh. Of course, this later became supposedly transferred to the duplicitous conduct of the Musta'sim's wazir, Ibn al-Alqami, who was seen to have been colluding with the Mongols for the overthrow of the Abbasi Khilafah and the destruction of Baghdad, in which, by the way, both Sunnis and Shi'as were killed. There were no specific safe conduct given to the Shi'as, as were given to the Christians, for example. But with the whole episode of the treacherous wazir, as it were, which is a commonly recurring literary theme, by the way, of that period, you end up with the prevalent notion amongst certainly jihadi Salafis of the treacherous nature of the Shia and their fifth column tendencies, and the word, the al-aqima, of course, we now see resurrected as being somehow associated with the Shia because of the supposed treachery, it hasn't yet been established historically, of the wazir. So the first 300 years of the Shia-Sunni, as it were, interrelationships in the Abbasi period, ended up with a widespread belief, even amongst moderate Sunnis, about the rejectionist nature of Shi'ism, the hidden doctrines that they have, and their willingness to deal and work with the enemies of Islam in order to undermine the Ummah. So with the Mongol invasion and the destruction of the Abbasi Empire, or what was left of it was already declined 200 years before that, these became, as it were, widespread notions. It became institutionalized in Sunni doctrine within 100 years after the fall of Baghdad to the Mongols. And the reason, of course, goes back to a number of fuqahas, especially Ibn Taymiyyah, who wrote a number of books, and a number of, he wrote about everything. He has about, 100 volumes of various, of very uneven works. But he was obsessed with the fear that the Shia are going to, that the Mongols are going to become Shias. And he thought that if this was going to happen, then the world of Islam was going to be turned on its head. So Ibn Taymiyyah's polemics against the Shia and the fear that they're going to affect the Mongols, the Ilkhanites, created the institutional and the doctrinal foundations of anti-Shiism, which then became, as it were, widespread amongst the community as a whole, and became, as it were, ingested into the body politics. I don't want to go into Ibn Taymiyyah and his what I think is generally disruptive role in Islamic history, but he is certainly one of the early and the most potent of the polemicists against the Shia, and whose ideas and thoughts have moved in time into the perceptions of the common man in the street. During the Mongol period and the subsequent, there were very, very few, the area was devastated. The whole area of the Middle East and Iran were completely ruined, so most of the cities were a fraction of their former size. So the idea of community conflicts was much reduced. There just wasn't a population or demographic base for it. But with the recovery that took place, Shi'ism, especially in its more extreme form, Ghulat form, began to spread amongst the Turkic tribes of Eastern Anatolia and of Iran, and began to threaten the rule of the emergent Ottomans. And one of the first targeted forms of early genocide was the destruction of the Qizilbash, so-called Qizilbash. They were the ghulats of the Shia who wore red caps by Sultan Selim, where up to 100,000 people were killed in eastern Anatolia. And this is behind the disturbances in Turkey today, because they're building a third bridge across the Bosphorus, and they want to call that bridge the Sultan Selim Bridge. And the Alawis, so-called Alawis of Turkey, who are the inheritors of the Qizilbash creed, see it obviously as a direct affront and assault on them. And this was before the Safawi era became formalized and established in Iran. So the relationship between the destruction of the Qizilbash and these large-scale deaths through state power were not really directly related to the establishment of Safawi power in Iran. The next case in my readings where the opposite happened, large-scale discrimination and killings of the other community, is when Shi'ism was established in Iran. As most of you probably know, Iran, before the founding of the Safavids, was mainly a Sunni country. But that doesn't mean there were no Shias in Iran. There were some 12 Shias, especially around Qom. But most of the Shias of Iran were ghulats, Ardabilis, Qizilbash, who would not necessarily be considered Orthodox Shias by the leaders of the Shia community. And this Ghulat Shi'ism was quite widespread in northwest Iran, and was of course a connection, an extension of the Qizilbash of eastern Anatolia. The numbers, there is some research on the costs, the human costs of establishing Shi'ism in Iran. And just in 2 episodes, one is the destruction of the Sufis of Tabriz in 1503. Nearly 14,000 people were killed. And the second episode is towards the latter period of the reign of Shah Abbas. Again, large-scale massacres took place in eastern Iran, especially in what is now Khorasan, where probably another 30 to 40,000 people were killed. And in between this period, this 150 period, where Shi'ism became established as the dominant creed in Iran, there was widespread discrimination and frequent episodes of expulsions and killings, and large numbers of people who refused to convert to Shi'ism left Iran. Most went to India and Central Asia. Some went to the Ottoman world. There was an attempt, a small attempt by Shah Ismail II to stop this and to turn Iran into a kind of a non-madhabi country. But he didn't last very long. And the effort to convert Iran to Shi'ism took another leap forward with Shah Abbas. By the mid-17th century, after 150 years, I think the game was over in Iran, and nearly the entire population, at least of Farsi speakers, was converted to Shi'ism. Nader Shah, who is outside of the Safawi framework, tried to create a kind of Sunni Shia reconciliation, mainly because his army was composed of various groups, and the Uzbeks, who were the backbone of his army, thought of the Shia as kuffar and would not fight in the same units. So he was completely religious, Nader Shah, but he was responsible for, I would think, the first attempt after al-Nasr, Khalifa al-Nasr Lidinillah, to try to create some kind of doctrinal basis for Shia-Sunni reconciliation. But as we all know, again, Nader Shah didn't last long either. The next case where there is large-scale destructions and decimations of entire population is the rise of the Wahhabi movement, which led to the raids into Iraq or in Karbala. The numbers are all over the place. Certainly in the low thousands of people were slaughtered, maybe one or 2,000 people. Some of the chroniclers talk about 15,000, but it's not possible because the entire population was being destroyed. So we come into modern times where we have this checkered history of mainly irreconcilable doctrinal differences, overlain by a kind of, I won't say benign coexistence, but a kind of coexistence in which the edges at least were maintained, the edges of civility and good neighborliness were maintained. And then breaking out into periods of extreme violence whenever politics and authority intervened. And as we enter into the 19th and 20th centuries, this doctrinal conflict was partly overlooked by the rise of modernist Islam, by the rise of the whole movement that wanted to find a response to Western encroachments, modernity, and so on. I mean, we all know that Jamal Din Afghani was a Shia, but that didn't stop him from being a major proponent of Pan-Islam. And the Pan-Islam that emerged as mainly a political response to the encroachments of the West, and then later the actual occupation of Muslim lands, was in its early days basically non-sectarian, but it did not really affect the common man. The Ottoman Empire had its own and built-in anti-Shia biases. Sometimes the authorities, I would like to add, did not always discriminate against the Shia. Sometimes they took their sides, depending on the local power relationships. Sunnis and Shi'as joined forces, for example, in fighting off the Babi heresy, and they petitioned jointly to Bab al-Ali, to the Sublime Porte, calling on them to act against the Babiyya, who subsequently became the precursors to the Baha'is. So there was some element of cooperation, but it was always one in which one part of it was on the defensive. I'm speaking about areas outside of Iran. If you look at the landscape, as it were, of intersectarian relationships by the beginning of the 20th century, you find four aspects to it. Depending on which party is doing, it is always the Shia juxtaposed against one aspect of Sunnism or another. The Shia juxtaposed against Wahhabism, of course, there was very little common ground here, and the takfir on the part of the Wahhabis was nearly total. Surprisingly, it wasn't much to do with the issue of the Imamah. It was to do more with the visitation of tombs. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab had this thing about visiting tombs, and he thought the Shias, and to a lesser extent Mutasawwifa, were implicit, culpable in this. You had a built-in anti-Shia bias within the early Salafi movement. For the simple reason is that their entire philosophical construct, their ideological construct, is to rethink Islam in terms of the purity of the early companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And you have here a very large group of people who don't attribute these qualities to the early Salaf. So there was a kind of built-in antipathy towards Shi'ism by the early modernist Islamists, whose discourse, I might add, was taken over later by Shia Islamists. But because of the emphasis on the early Salaf and the emphasis on their actions and their purity and their magnanimity and so on, a view which is not shared by the Shia, there was a kind of disjunction between these two. The third sort of worldview that affected these relationships was a worldview that was one way or another associated with, I would call it, moderate Hanafism of the Ottoman Empire. It's basically a form of benign neglect. We accept you at a certain level, but in terms of institutions, in terms of access to power, in terms of access to privilege and so on, there will be limits to how far. But otherwise, you can do what you want as long as you don't openly declare various aspects of your practices or doctrines that we find unacceptable. And then you have another very powerful anti-Shia discourse that emerged out of India. And this has very little to do with Wahhabism, by the way. It's to do specifically with the Deobandism and its precursor, Shah Wali Allah, the son of Shah Aziz, the son of Shah Wali Allah. This was, again, a fear that somehow Shi'ism is spreading like wildfire in British India, and that the doctrines were being accepted by the mass, and that Shia works were converting large numbers of people. And the polemic was to do with, how do you stop this? How do you stop this from occurring? And Shah Abdul Aziz, is probably the institutionalizer and the formalizer of anti-Shi'ism within the Indian Sunni tradition. And he wrote a number of books on this. The most important one is called التحفة للاثنى عشرية نصيحة المؤمنين وفضيحة الشياطين. It was entirely directed against the Shia and entered into the discourse of the Deobandis. Now, in India, there were very large Shia communities in some Shia states, for example, Lucknow and Awad. By and large, the British did not take sides in these inter-sectarian conflicts, but these riots between the various communities, especially during Muharram, did not reach the level of mass destruction and killings and so on. There were probably disturbances that led to maybe a few dozen or maybe a few hundred killed. And then matters came back into a kind of harmony. There's a very large current within traditional Indian Sunni Islam, which has taken on a number of the major tenets of Shi'ism, particularly the love of Ahlul Bayt and the veneration of Imam Ali, which the Deobandis were unable to exercise. And in time, by the 1950s, I would think that the repetitive discourse that was used against the Shia generally were on the defensive. You can't talk about a kind of retort discourse. It is always the Shias trying to refute accusations leveled against them, rather than the Shias finding flaws or faults in the other's doctrines. And this is, I think, understandable given the fact that they are a minority in the Islamic world, and the nature of a minority generally is to be accepted and accommodated for by the majority. I've listed the 10 most common accusations that were hurled against the Shia and sort of crystallized into a kind, I won't say into a doctrinal position of the Sunnis, but crystallized into a generally acknowledged belief. First of all is the whole thing about that the Shia doctrine is an invention of this converted Yemenite Jew, Abdullah ibn Saba. This keeps on repeating itself. It was brought to a very high degree of elaboration by Shah Abdul Aziz, but it's been there since Ibn Taymiyyah. Related to that is the accusations that is held against the Shia of being constantly changing their doctrines. That the Shia of the early Imams is not the Shia of today. And by today, I don't mean today, I mean any event that was in the last 1400 years. The other theme that repeats itself is the duplicitous strategies used by the Shia to subvert and to convert those who don't notice these stratagems. The constant referrals to the Shia as munafiqs. The use of dubious histories and isnads for their doctrines. The idea, the ilahiyat of the Shia. Their description and their understanding of prophethood, of imamah, of resurrection or ma'ad. And of course the sab and the indictments of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Aisha, and the Sahaba. These have been themes that have been going on for the last 1,000 years. So when we hear them today, or when anybody hears them today, mouthed by Daesh, or mouthed by the Taliban, or mouthed by even some supposedly reputable ulamas, supposedly, I say, like Qaradawi and so on. These are tropes that keep on reappearing and seem to have a life of their own. And you cannot argue the Shia counter-retort not only falls on deaf ears, it in fact reinforces these tropes. So, but underlying all of that, the reason why I've also discussed that there was an element not of harmony, but of coexistence, an element of recognition of boundaries and limits, which were nearly only disrupted when there was a major political crisis. And the role of those in authority and those in power in ameliorating these differences, negotiating these differences, softening these differences is really crucial. There isn't a built-in desire to riot and to kill. And the depth of resentments is not that great. It can be made to be great, but it ebbs and flows. And this is where the political circumstances in which these tensions and confrontations take place is really critical. And it's critical, I think, to understand the future course of Sunni-Shia relationships, because we're living in an age now where the aspect of the political is critical in determining the course of these relationships. Now, why are all these themes and all these, we call them tropes, because some of them are to do with literary forms. For example, the treacherous wazir who opens the gates of the city to the invading army is a constantly repeated theme in Arabic and Islamic literature. It's applied to Ibn al-Alqami, and those who are in that ambit are now known as the Alaqima. And these terms came up in a very, very potent way after 2003. I mean, hardly ever were terms like Safawis used before, or Alaqima, or even, I think, rather stupidly, Buwayhiya, because the Buwayhis, as I was trying to outline, were not as pro-Shia as people think they were. I think the reason is really there are three historical inflection points, in my opinion, that have taken place in the last 40 years. One of them, of course, is the Iranian Revolution in Iran, which, because it was determinedly Shia, even though it was expressed in early days in a pan-Islamic form, but the institutional mechanisms of it and the constitutional form it took, it was Shia. It says so in the Constitution, and uses Shia doctrines and themes to underlie and to form its ideological frame. So this is the first time we have an Islamic state, a consciously Islamic state, designed and formulated to a large extent using the ideologies and doctrines of Islamic modernism, but framed in a Shia context that emerged as a major power in the area. The second inflection point is April 2003 in Iraq, where for the first time in history, you have a Imami-controlled state in an Arabic-speaking land. Now, I say Imami, I don't mean Fatimi here, because we had Fatimis. And it's looking at it from the point of view of the long span of history. It, in many ways, is a slap in the face to the idea of a kind of Islamic unity framed in the consensual perspective of the Jama'ah Sunni. The concern for unity, the concern for a kind of common ground has been turned on its head. Now, you may have all your points of differences with those in power in Iraq, but nevertheless, this is undoubted reality that there has been this profound shift. It has never happened. And that explains, I think, the, first of all, very confused and then very violent response to this change, which is now continuing in a different way in Syria, where you don't have the certainty of Imami rule in Syria. You have the rule of the outcasts of Islam, as seen from the Jama'ah Sunni point of view. And by the outcasts of Islam, I mean who? The par excellence, the Nusayris, the Alawis. Shias, Ithna Asharis in Syria are not that large in number, maybe 500,000. You have non-Muslims and heterodox sects like Druze and so on, somehow forming a coalition that is going to enshrine this trend in power. So this goes, again, dramatizes to a large number of people the significance of this conflict. And the response that you're getting is to some extent commensurate with the historic significance of this act. Now, Syria, here you have a form of government that to some extent covered these various factions and various groups in a kind of bland, well, not so bland, secular Arab nationalism. With these covers off, the contrast becomes even more stark. And I think Syria, in this case, is also a major disjunction, which will have huge, huge effects in the future. Not because it's going to cement some kind of Shia crescent, but it's going to confirm that there is an alternative form, alternative expression of legitimate power and authority that challenges the orthodoxy. How will all this end? I mean, I really have no idea how it's going to end. I mean, a lot of it depends on the military struggle going on in Syria right now. I think the change in Iraq is permanent, simply because of the pressures of demography. How will that affect the next cycle of intercommunal and intersectarian relationships? I think if we do not undertake really a major attempt to transcend these sometimes poisonous legacies of the past, the conflict will become even more intense. It's now gone to parts of the world where there are no Shias, for example, in Malaysia. I mean, I live in Singapore in the last year now, and I know what's happening. There's probably maybe 200,000 Shias in Malaysia, and maybe 1 million in Indonesia. It is no different, I think, from the fear and anxiety and the sense of dread and doom that minorities feel whenever there is a looming existential threat. Really, I mean, if you're a Malaysian Shia, you would be in a state where very little difference between you, let's say, and a Jew in Germany in 1935. It is a sense of doom. It may not, I don't think it will happen. There will not be sort of physical execution or elimination of people. But any incident in Indonesia, for example, if some kind of Salafi alim or Wahhabi alim is assassinated by some very angry young man, the response can be devastating, and it can be as bad as we've had in history. So the effects of all of this is no longer confined to the heartland of what I call the heartland, that is the Eastern Arab world, Iran, Pakistan, where these communities exist in very large numbers, and their interrelationships over time was the stuff, as it were, of of history. Here you're talking about outlying areas where there are very few, but still these themes recur. The sense that there's a fifth column burrowing away, a sense that there are people inside the fortress who are going to open the gates to the Mongols, is very, very deeply rooted. I see it, we're now entering it to a stage where I think the cycle that began with modernist Islam, began with Afghani and Abdu and Rashid Rida and all these people, and continued in the 20th century. That cycle has ended. That cycle had in it the promise that a modernist Islam might be non-sectarian or trans-sectarian. The actual fact is that it has ended in deep sectarian divisions. It has ended in the failure, I think, of the idea of an Islamic state. And I think it has ended in the increasing Salafization, possibly Wahhabization, of Orthodox Sunni Islam, which had in it, even though in a very narrow and circumscribed space, a place for Imami Shi'ism. It has no place for other kinds of Shi'as, but for Zaydis, yes, but for Imami Shi'ism. That is now under threat. You cannot, I think, confront this threat by either political concessions or by trying to find doctrinal points. The whole episode of Taqrib, which started with Shaltut and so on, ended really in a dead end, complete dead end. I mean, the Azhar reversed itself and is no longer I don't know what's going to happen now, but it certainly has abandoned the idea that there is a doctrinal basis for Shia-Sunni reconciliation. The Amman message of 2004-2005, which was signed on by nearly everyone, is completely ignored, even by those who signed it. It is refuted, and it's some kind of embarrassment that seems to linger on. So the idea of taqreeb as being a way in which you can somehow bridge these differences and lead to resolution of what are essentially political issues now is, I think, a non-starter. The issue now, as it has always been, is the recognition that there are two orthodoxies in Islam, that there are two ways of looking at this, each of them true in their own terms. Now, of course, if you're in one camp, you think of yourself as being the exclusive holder of the truth, and I have no problem with people in that camp thinking that way. But there must be an understanding that when you leave the realm of what is scriptural, what is doctrinal, into the realm of the political, these things have to be left behind. You cannot claim a monopoly of the truth when you are trying to formulate a political strategy. That can only lead to the crushing of one or the other. Neither of these groups are going to be eliminated by arguments and by polemics and by satellite stations screaming and shouting at each other, or by people trying to find points of connection. There are points of connection. Of course there are points of connection. But there's also a huge overlay of doctrinal and creedal differences, which you cannot ignore. I mean, religions have that. But once you enter into the political space, this cannot be the basis for action. It cannot be. Because if you believe, as you should, if you're part of one community or the other, that you have a kind of hold on the truth, you must also concede that others think they also have a similar hold on their truth. And both of these truths are true to each group. It's a very, very big challenge, and I don't think it has been sorted out successfully. There is no country in the world, I think, at least in the Muslim world I'm talking about, which has successfully forged a common religious policy where it has large competing and contending communities. The way forward has to be a kind of a transcendental Islam, I call it, where you agree on what you must agree on, and then do not argue and do not criticize and do not enter into confrontations and polemics on the other, within a political system that doesn't privilege one or the other, unless you intend to eliminate the public traces of the other. There's a huge difference, and I don't want to make any equivalence, let's say, between the trials that the Shias face, for example, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia. You cannot compare that to the trials and tribulations of the Sunnis in Iran. There's no equivalence. One is a complete exclusion. One is complete elimination of any awareness of that position in the public space. The other limits it, true, in certain areas, but nevertheless gives it its due respect and recognition and acknowledgement. Any attempt to impose an exclusivity of doctrine in a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian environment is bound to be destructive. So I conclude really by saying the problem is not finding commonalities, but going to the bases of it and seeing that that these two traditions, these two orthodoxies, emerged from one great event. And it is that event that must be the common ground from which variances and variations emerge. In my own limited way, I'm trying to deal with this issue, not by talking about the points of commonalities, but by transcending differences and trying to find a rootedness in the original effulgence, as it were, of the event that emerged in 7th century Arabia, from which we all draw our spiritual and religious sustenance. Thank you.